Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar on next steps, exploring options beyond clerkships and graduate programs. My name's Ruth Barron and I'm a National Career Strategist at the College of Law. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which each of us live, work and study. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture and hope of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. In particular, I pay my respects to the Gadigal, upon whose land I am standing. We have a few guidelines for our webinar today. Please submit your questions via the Q&A function. The session is being recorded and we will share it with participants afterwards. If you do lose connection, you can log back in again using the same meeting details provided. And please take the time at the end to complete a quick survey on the session and any ideas that you might have for future webinars. Now, I'd like to introduce our lawyers for today's program. Please welcome Jimmy No, Legal Counsel, Strategic Sourcing at Commonwealth Bank, and Lucas Moctezuma, Lawyer, Avant Law in Australia. Here we are with both of them, but I'm going to give you a brief introduction for our speakers. So Jimmy is an in-house procurement lawyer and a former private practice lawyer. During his time in private practice, he worked at Cause Chambers Westcott and HWL Ebsworth and advised on contentious construction and projects matters. He started his legal career as a graduate at law at HWL Ebsworth. Outside of his 9-to-5 job, he enjoys mentoring law students and writing content on professional development for law students. You may have seen those. He's open about the fact that he missed out on a seasonal clerkship as a law student, and he's also written various articles targeted at law students and graduates about applying for seasonal clerkships and graduate programs on publications like Lawyers Weekly and LinkedIn. Lucas is an employment lawyer for Avant, a medico indemnity insurance company, where he acts for doctors and medical clinics in employment-related disputes. He cut his teeth as a legal officer with the Transport Workers Union of New South Wales after missing out on a large number of clerkship positions with mid-tier and top-tier firms. He's worked as a legal editor for Thomson Reuters, as a research assistant for an aviation law consultancy, and as a reservist for the Australian Army. He landed a graduate position with HWL Ebsworth in 2020, got admitted as a lawyer in 2021, and went on to work for specialist employment law firm Kingston Reid before making the move to Avant. Lucas also writes regular stories about legal practice on his LinkedIn, and he hopes lawyers around the world will enjoy them. I'm going to get the ball rolling with a question for both Jimmy and Lucas, but I'll ask Jimmy to start. So both of you are pretty vocal about the fact that you can succeed without getting a clerkship or a graduate program. So how did you do it?
Thanks, Ruth, and thanks for the introduction. Quite makes me sound more impressive than I'd like to think.
I think you're pretty impressive, Jimmy, anyway. So, welcome to the webinar.
I personally missed out on seasonal clerkships. Some of you may be going through the process this year. And I guess, I applied for clerkships in 2017, got a few interviews, got to the final stage interview for 2 firms, and I basically didn't get an offer at the end of the day. So that summer, in 2017 to 18, I spent my time doing a tax internship at one of the big 4 professional services firms. Really used and leveraged that experience when applying for grad programs in my final year, and basically landed my grad role at HWL Ebsworth. So I guess, it was really back on the back of my time at the big 4 accounting firms that I was able to become a more competitive applicant in my final year, and started my grad program at HWL in 2019.
What about you, Lucas?
So I was rejected by a lot of clerkships, and I was totally gutted. I was sold this impression that I needed to have a clerkship to be successful. And so I applied for everything I could think of, all the top tiers, all the mid tiers, went through their interview processes, went through their assessment centers, and I got close with some of them, but then the rejection started dripping in. And the bad thing about these processes, it's not like one of these all-in-one, you're rejected from all of them type things. It's one of these things where they just keep drip feeding the rejections. You know, just one email after another saying, we regret to inform you, we regret to inform you, we regret to inform you. And so that sort of was torture for weeks and weeks. And I didn't have a backup plan. And I was like, well, what the hell am I going to do now? So luckily what I did was I got this opportunity to work at a trade union. And trade union is really good because I got to go in there and get experience advocating in the Industrial Relations Commission and the Fair Work Commission pretty early on. Something I probably wouldn't have done if I got a clerkship. And that's where I really learned to cut my teeth on employment law, which ultimately I now specialize in. And looking back, it's like, well, if I'd had a clerkship, I mean, my life would be totally different, perhaps. And I certainly wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now, maybe. So I'm really grateful that I didn't get a clerkship. But I know for a lot of the people in this meeting, you're stressed out of your minds. I think some grad offers or rejections were just put through. And if you're not feeling if you're not feeling excited about the future, if you're feeling depressed, if you're feeling upset, I get it. I went there, I went through it all. I was gutted, but it's just a phase. This will pass, and you're going to be fine in the long term. So,
well, just on that, Lucas, you said your life would have been very different if you'd received an offer. Would it have been different in a good way or a bad way, do you think?
I think probably a bad way. I'd be sucked into working for a large law firm. And that's a terrifying thought.
You don't think you'd be a good match for that?
No way. No way. I'm too casual. I'm too non-corporate, which is funny because I work for a Van Law, which is a large insurance company now, but it's so different to working for a large law firm. I did get the big law firm experience in my grad program and stuff like that, but where I am now, out of that environment, is just so much better, like so much better. It would take a lot for me to go back to working for a law firm.
What about you, Jimmy? Do you think it was better for you? And both of you did get grad offers, and took up grad programs in a law firm. But Jimmy, do you think your life would have been different if you had received a clerkship offer?
Yeah, I would say so in terms of, you go through the motions, you pick rotations as a seasonal clerk. And, maybe I would have been thrown to, I don't know, M&A and banking law. I never did those as a grad, but, maybe my life direction or what area of law I'm practicing now may be very different. I'd second Lucas's point. I work at Combank now, and I probably don't intend to return to private practice, but it is a different environment, and what I always say is you don't really know what's good or bad or what's neutral, I'll say, for someone. I think the big law environment, the top tier law environment is good for some people but not great for others. It's funny because a lot of people who do clerkships go into grad program may last for 2-3 years and then they're out. They go in-house or they go down to a smaller firm, and then some people who start their careers in a smaller firm actually make their way up and start have very long and successful careers in the top tier law environment. So you never know what may happen over the course of, let's say, a 10, 15, 30 year career. So that's what I'd say.
I mean, on average, firms receive more than 2,000 applications each for a few dozen clerkship positions. So it is a bit of a numbers game. If you had considered those pretty dire odds when you were applying for clerkships, would it have made a difference to how you felt about not getting a clerkship? Or did you already know those odds?
Yeah, I sort of already knew that they take a small fraction of applicants. I think no matter how much you try and logically justify it, you're still going to feel like crap if you get rejected. And so it's really an emotional journey rather than a logical one, I would say. Because when you're rejected, it's not personal. These law firms have so many applications to consider, and for whatever reason, you just didn't quite make it. It was somebody else who did. But like, it's just like it's like dating. It's honestly the same thing. It takes two to tango. You get rejected, you move on to the next one, and there's always other fish in the sea, better fish in the sea. So just treat it like that. It's a very, very small phase of your life. I noticed somebody posted in the Q&A, how important were your grades? What was your WAM? I think I got a distinction average. So maybe I'm not the best person to answer that question, but I know for a fact that when I got my job at the Transport Workers Union, they didn't look at my grades at all. I could have got a pass average or a credit average and they still would have taken me. You know, um, People put a lot of pressure on themselves to get the good marks, and still, yeah, study hard, study hard, work hard, get the best grade you can. But if you don't, I didn't get a single high distinction, when I went through my law degree. I got other people did, but I didn't. And so if put pressure on yourself to study hard, but if you only get like a credit average, or if you only get a few passes and stuff, you're not gonna. No one cares really towards the end. Like when I applied for this job here, no one cared about my marks.
It's
So
about getting your foot in the door, I think,
yeah,
though.
it's just
People are aiming quite high to get some of those clerkship offers. What about you, Jimmy? Are you willing to talk a little bit about your grades as well?
Yeah. So I think so I did a commerce and law degree. My overall WAM was a distinction average, but my law WAM, I think at the time of applying, was kind of high credit. So I was a credit average law student. And I think, obviously I think having a higher WAM helps. If you had an 80 average, a lot of the bigger firms will look at you as a quality candidate, obviously subject to how good the rest of your application is. But marks are a point of competitive advantage. But that said, I ended up with a few interview offers from some of the biggest firms in the country, despite having only credit average. So really sell up the other parts of your application. WAM is only one thing. There's your extracurricular activities, your work experience, especially legal experience, but even customer service experience. Really sell those things, because at the end of the day, your WAM, it's going to be what it is at the end of the semester. But you can always control other things, and how you sell yourself plays a part in the application process. But yeah, in terms of the numbers game, we're talking about, let's say, the top firm may hire, let's say, 50 seasonal clerks, and there's 1,000 applicants. You're talking 5% or less than that, or chance of getting an offer. That's very the odds aren't really in most people's favor. So I think having some perspective, but I do get it. Everyone would like to think that they are in the top 1%, top 5%, top 0.5%, whatever the statistic is.
Yeah, look, honestly, you say the odds aren't in your favor. It's really like the Hunger Games. Seriously, like that's how it feels. And so if you don't volunteer as tribute, get in there and get slaughtered, you're winning, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I think as long as you give it your best shot, you can be proud at the end of the day, no matter what the outcome is. And if anything I've learned is it helped me in my future job applications, whether it was in my grad year or even applying, as a more experienced lawyer to other roles. So
yeah. Definitely. We've got some questions now starting to pour in, which is great. We're going to try and answer as many as we can.
Why do you choose not to work in a large law firm than what you're doing now? Where do I start? First of all,
that's a tough question.
Where I'm working now, there's no increment hourly billing. There's none of this tracking your time when you work. In law firms, in every single law firm I've worked at, you need to like literally measure 6-minute use of your time. You need to bill for phone calls. You need to bill for sending emails. You need to bill for all this sort of stuff. And at the end of the day, you're left with a reflection of what your billable hours had been. And in my case, I rarely met my billable hours target. Another reason why the law firms probably don't like me too much. I rarely met it. And so at the end of the day, you're left with this, I didn't do that much work today. And so I never get that at this insurance company. I still work hard though. I can see some of my colleagues are in the chat. I still work hard, but I don't record my time. And
Yeah.
another thing is the culture. You know, the culture is it's very commercial, it's very intense, it's very driven. It's very sort of like, you know, there's a lot of pressure to the point where you work long hours, and you just get stuck where your work becomes your identity a lot of the time. Um, and where I work now, you know, it's very work is separate from home. You know, I can work from home more. In my previous firms, there was this pressure not to work from, like, to come to the office more often. And at the current place that I'm working, it's sort of like a 50-50 rule, you know, 50% from home, 50% in the office. It's just the culture is so much better. I feel like I can speak with my colleagues more. I feel like I can talk about my feelings and things with my colleagues much more than I could at a law firm.
Mm.
Um, and it's just I just feel so much happier. Um, and so
Yeah.
I think it's just the people I work with as well, you know, I mean, they're just incredible people. And I would never abandon them, you know.
Mm.
So
We've got lots of questions coming through, and I'd like to make sure that we kind of answer some of them. Be aware that if we don't get to all your questions, I'm going to try and ask Jimmy and Lucas to answer them offline. If you're anonymous, I can't send those answers to you. So if you want to get answers to questions and we don't have time to answer them today, use your name so that I can get both of them to answer for you. But I guess we've sort of talked about, Lucas, maybe why maybe a clerkship or even working in private practice wasn't for you. But for Jimmy, you're actually working for, in some ways, a corporate or a corporation. So why do you think that's perhaps a better fit for you than it would have been, a graduate program in a top tier firm or a mid tier firm?
Yeah, I think in-house, was kind of something I've always considered. Even when I was applying for clerkships and grad programs, I felt, my long-term future would probably be working, possibly working in-house. Obviously, you should never be closed-minded about, where you end up but it was a serious consideration for me. So after a few years of, private practice, I felt that I kind of developed, some core technical legal skills, and I was kind of ready to kind of, try, the in-house life. Obviously, your in-house employee can be anywhere. It could be, talking big corporate, ASX listed companies, or government, or, non-for-profit. So, I think the in-house spectrum is so broad, and that there's a place for anyone and everyone, I'd like to think, as a lawyer. But yeah, I felt that working in kind of commercial law was still my thing. So I felt, commercial law is still, fun and games for me. But I felt the in-house environment was something I wanted to try, and
Yeah.
I'm loving it so far. So yeah.
Yeah. And we've got a quick question then for you, Jimmy, about the idea of starting immediately in-house, specifically for those bigger banks and investment banks. So is it possible to do that? Can you start immediately in a sort of junior role?
Yeah, so you can. I mean, some of these organizations will have formal grad programs. Think of the likes of your AMPs, your CBAs, or even talking about like Woolworths. These large organizations will have kind of law grad programs, and I don't know when applications are open or closed, but I think what I'll say is they tend to be very competitive. I would actually say even more competitive in terms of the amount of spots available, because they may hire, say, 2 or 3 grads. Meanwhile, these big law firms will be hiring like 50. So, I would say it's still very competitive, but it is an option. And I think the mindset has changed in recent years about, is private practice the best place to start? Well, it really depends what you want for your career, what type of lawyer you want to be. Are you more a transactional lawyer, more commercial in your thinking? And, is your long-term plan to be a very technically excellent lawyer, or is your plan to, be very commercial? And so, I think, you can start at those places. There's applications available. And I think one thing I'll say is that, for example, if you wanted to work at Woolworths, for example, and you applied for their law grad program and you didn't get an offer, consider their other kind of commercial roles. So apply for the grad program in, say, accounting, finance, or whatever other divisions they may have. And you can always kind of build your relationship with the legal team in that organization. And you never know. I've known people who've started in other areas, whether it's finance, accounting, HR, marketing, whatever it may be, and transition into a legal role at the organization. So it's always, a way to get your foot in the door.
Definitely. And just on a personal note, in government, you can sometimes start in policy and move over into legal. And there are other alternatives to private practice that also have grad programs like government. We've got a question here. Did you have legal experience when applying for clerkships? I'll go with you, Lucas. Did you have legal experience when you applied for clerkship?
Yeah, I had some. In my first year of law, I got lucky and volunteered once a week to work at some personal injury law firm out in Western Sydney. And it was pretty good. It didn't last long, but then I got a job at another personal injury law firm in the city. So yeah, I did have some legal experience. It was like sort of like a registration clerk. Like I would go to the Supreme Court and the District Court and just get subpoenas and photocopy them and then stuff like that. So I mean, I had some experience, but nothing too in depth. And honestly, if you don't have legal experience before going into these clerkship and grad applications, it's not fatal. A lot of these firms will actually appreciate a non-legal experience because it shows you're well-rounded. So there's no pressure to get legal experience early on, that's for sure.
Definitely. And Jimmy, did you have legal experience before you started applying?
Nothing paid. I volunteered at the Redfern Legal Centre and had kind of more pro bono experience, but I never was like a law firm paralegal, so not in the kind of law firm environment. No, and I think I agree with Lucas. Sometimes the firms actually value kind of non-legal experience. Obviously, legal experience is great if you can get it, but I would say there is a sizable amount of some clerks who probably have never stepped foot in a law firm before then. So, don't be down on yourself if you haven't, had 2 years as a paralegal somewhere. I'd say, it's not absolutely necessary.
Yeah. Look, we've got another question here, and I think this is actually about how you got your graduate program offers. Did you apply, through a particular program, or did you network, for example, or use LinkedIn?
So
I was just going to say, Lucas, if not, if you didn't apply, what did you do to get those offers? Yeah.
So I actually wanted to be an aviation lawyer when I was going through school. I didn't have in my mind that I wanted to be an employment lawyer. I really wanted to be an aviation lawyer, and I found the transport team at HW Ebsworth was exactly where I wanted to go. And so for literally 2 years, I would keep in touch with some of the partners in that transport team. I met them at some clerkship networking drinks. I kept in touch with them for ages. And I met other people, as many people as I could within that team, or people who knew people in that team at various events. I mean, I networked like a machine when I was at university. And I think that is probably more valuable than grades, to be honest, is networking. Because as a lawyer, I mean, the power is in your network. The success of your job will be heavily dependent on relationships with colleagues, with barristers, with judges and judges associates, and PAs, receptionists, secretaries, literally everybody. So just network the absolute crap out of yourself, because it will pay off. And it did for me in the end, because I ended up getting a job as an aviation lawyer after I finished my grad program at Ebsworth. So I applied for the grad program in the usual way, but I really networked my way to the exact job I wanted, which was being an aviation lawyer. And then after a year, I'm like, you know what? I want to be an employment lawyer now. So I left. Which is funny how that works out. But yeah, no, 100% obviously go through the hoops they want you to, but network as much as you can, for sure.
And networking, not just on LinkedIn, but a whole range of ways of networking.
LinkedIn has made it so much easier to network with people now. It's so funny. The other day, somebody, I got off the phone with my old boss, and he was looking for a paralegal. And then literally like 30 minutes after I got off the phone call with him, somebody like started to follow me on LinkedIn. She was a second year law student studying commerce or something. I'm like, huh. So I messaged her and I'm like, hey, do you want a job? Because my old boss is looking for someone. And she's like, yeah, okay. And then I got them in touch. And then next thing I know, she's actually working for my old boss now. So, I mean, there is incredible power in LinkedIn networking. You never know who you're going to meet online or in person that'll lead to whatever opportunities you got.
So remember, I did say at the beginning of this webinar that you can connect with Jimmy or Lucas on LinkedIn. It might actually be worth your while to do something like that and to network. And I'm assuming, Jimmy, you also use the power of networking, but I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, I mean, as a grad, I did go through kind of the formal application processes for clerkships and grad programs. But I would say, in terms of future roles as an experienced lawyer, I think knowing people and even I think in Lucas's case, if someone is able to vouch for you, that's very powerful. I think they say that a lot of jobs are secured through networks later on in life, so it's a skill that you should develop even if it doesn't serve you as a grad or a uni student. It will serve you later on, so you might as well develop those skills now, because your dream job may be right around the corner in, say, 5 years time, and if you have built those relationships, then it makes it much easier.
And those jobs might be hidden. I mean, as Lucas just said, that job that he connected his ex-boss with someone who connected with him, a paralegal, that wasn't advertised. So sometimes those roles come up in a hidden format. What is something you would have done differently for your job application? If you could go back to your applications for clerkships, what would you have done differently?
I wouldn't have applied for anything. I'm serious. I just wouldn't have applied. Waste of time for me.
Is it a waste of time, Lucas, or do you think the process of being interviewed would actually be quite useful?
It put me through hell. It gave me character. It put me in the position where I can now talk today in this webinar. Like, okay, fine, I stand corrected.
No, I'm not trying to correct you at all. I'm just because I think we mentioned earlier that I also went through all of the clerkship programs when I was going through law school, but I treated it differently in that it was more of an information gathering session for me to see if I wanted to work for those firms. So I saw it as actually quite beneficial.
No, look, the best value is networking and just learning how these firms operate. So if anything, yeah, still do it. So if there's anything that I would have done differently, yes, there is. So I went to the Ashurst Clark networking process. And in the last ever clerkship sort of stage, at one of their networking drinks, I drank too much. And I probably said things I shouldn't have.
Right.
Done that. Don't drink too much at these events. Don't have too much fun, guys. Seriously, I know it's hard. It was hard for me, but don't have too much fun.
Yeah, I think that's a really important message to get out there, because I think those drinking sessions that they have, or the networking sessions where they're providing you with drink, can be a little bit dangerous in terms of what you provide.
Probably a test, to be honest. I think they test you.
It probably is a test, yes, because they want you to be able to network at functions with their clients and so on. So, yeah. And Jimmy, would you have changed anything about your job applications?
Yeah, I think from an application perspective, I think it'd be two things. So I think first is more kind of a mindset thing. So it's not really what I write or what I say. It's more going in knowing that no matter what happens, you will be okay. You may not get a clerkship, you may not get a grad program, but plenty of people have not and ended up, building amazing careers. I mean, Susan Kiefel, she was like a paralegal for a very long time, and look at where her career ended up. I think, there's probably, general counsels, partners who only got one clerkship offer or started their career at like a smaller place, and end up forging amazing careers. So I think, know that you'll be okay. And then from application perspective, I would say for me, my kryptonite was interviews. I'm not saying I got like 10 interviews or anything, but when I got to the interview, I stood a chance. But I guess it was really, relaxing myself, putting myself in the best state of mind, not, exerting too much self-pressure. Because I think your performance at the interview at the end of the day is what gets you across the line or doesn't get you across the line.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, my role at the College of Law is to do things like mock interviews with some of our students. I'd really recommend that if you have that option to do a mock interview, even with your university career service, it can be really beneficial to boost your confidence. There are, and you've mentioned these, there are other alternative ways to get into some of those top or mid-tier law firms if you miss out on a clerkship. And one of the questions we've got here is, did either of you try again for a clerkship in your final year, which is a possibility to do?
Yeah, I personally didn't, but I think a lot of people do. So lots of people will basically use their final year as a kind of second chance at clerkships. You'll need to check with the firm if you're eligible to do so, but I think a lot of firms do allow that. And usually, let's say in your final year that summer, you do a clerkship. You can either immediately roll into the grad program like 2 months later or whatever, or you might just spend the next year go traveling, have a gap year, enjoy life, or be a paralegal, for a bit of money and use that to travel. I mean, we're outside of COVID now, so I mean, well, COVID is still a thing, but the effects aren't really there anymore. So I guess use that year to travel or whatever. So I personally didn't, but I've known people who have. And second time around, you have more experience, you know what to do better. And I'm sure there are people who have secured clerk roles the second time around. And I've personally seen it in the law firms I've worked.
Yeah. What about you, Lucas? Did you try again to apply for a clerkship in your final year? No. It was the first time around.
Well, I did a grad job. I just applied for a grad job.
Yeah.
Second time
Yeah.
around.
I'm going to ask a question here about what it was like watching your friends receive clerkship offers. You were receiving rejections. Like looking back, is there something that might have helped you get through that?
You mean get through the absolute insane level of jealousy and pain of watching? I remember this one guy, great bloke. He was a good friend of mine, but he was like this high achieving, high distinction, black letter, aced every single bloody exam. And we would always compare marks, and he would just always do better than me. And he ended up getting something like 10 offers and from everything. And now he's like some sort of high flying lawyer at one of the big firms. When he told me he got a few clerkship like offers and I didn't get any, I was gutted. I was so upset. But honestly, just emotional support from friends, family, and going to events like this honestly helped as well. Like just constant reassurance that it was going to be fine, because family and friends, none of my family or friends really like that I could rely on were lawyers, so they didn't really know what I was going through. So speaking to actual lawyers in the profession, who and understanding their journey and understanding their experiences did provide me reassurance at the end of the day. And then when I got a job at the union, I was like, clerkship? What's a clerkship? So, yeah.
Yeah. How about you, Jimmy?
Yeah, I would say, second Lucas, attending these type of events, speaking to lawyers, you'll get that perspective. I think one thing to note is at the end of the day, I'll say the outcast, the people who didn't get seasoned clerkship roles, would be part of the majority. You're not the minority. I think when you talk to people who got offers, you feel like, oh, everyone got an offer. You speak to 5 different people, but at the end of the day, the people who don't get offers are the majority. So, embrace that, know that, you're, in the shoes of many people who've gone through the process before you. And, I think going just to my other point, a career is very long. There are people who do clerkships, get into the big firms, but actually don't last in the legal profession as long as someone who, let's say, didn't get a clerk role, started their career in a small firm or small organization and, made their way up and end up, working at these, big law firms or, big corporate organizations and have very long and sustainable careers. So, embrace that, know that it's really a long game at the end of the day.
Yeah, which kind of leads on to a question too. If you do miss out on a clerkship or a grad program, what are some ways to get your foot in the door? And you've just mentioned one of those, which is working in a small firm and then moving into a larger firm. Um, have you sort of seen success stories of people being able to get into some of those law firms when they've missed out?
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen, when I was at HWL Ebsworth, I've seen colleagues who use that experience to go into, even larger firms. For example, I've, seen people who started their roles in, say, a big corporate in kind of a non-legal role, but through the power of networking, relationship building, get a in-house legal role at that place. So, and I think, use, those recruiters on LinkedIn, and use the services that the College of Law provides. There are definitely ways to kind of, get to, a top tier law firm if that's what you want. For me personally, I never, I actually realized that it probably wasn't going to be for me. And I did do a stint at Cause Chambers Westgarth, great law firm. But in terms of my long-term future, I thought I'd try something else. But I'd say, yeah, when it comes down to it, there are definitely many ways. You just have to use the resources around you, and also talk to people, build relationships, and you never know what type of role you might get.
If you want to make those moves, I mean, relationships and knowing people is always key. And look, if you don't get a clerkship, like, use the time that you would have been doing clerkships to just do something else. Like, you are going to be working for the rest of your life. You are going to spend 40 hours in an office plus slaving away on files. And that's going to be, and you're going to be doing that until you're like, probably by the time you guys are old enough, the retirement age will be like 120 years old or something ridiculous. You're going to be working your whole life. Just don't rush. Enjoy life while you're young and have fun. Go out and socialize, go to the beach, go and party, go and like do things that people in their early 20s do. And just like, the career will come. I use the time as well to learn things that are not legal related. Like, it's never been easier now to, for example, to start an online business and make some side money. You can go into, you can learn, teach yourself about things like SEO, of copywriting, of freelance journalism, or e-commerce, or whatever. Teach yourself something non-legal. Get yourself some entrepreneurial experience by starting a side hustle, so that when you end up getting a job in law, you've still got that extra wad of cash that you're earning on the side as well. Do that for yourself. Eventually, through your networking, like Jimmy said, you can get to wherever you want to in law, but honestly, just use the time to just do something else.
Yeah,
I guess that's good advice. Jimmy, what advice would you give for someone who's missed out on a clerkship or perhaps a grad program?
Yeah, I would, I would actually second Lucas's point about consider non-legal things. So you may realize that the law is still for you, but for some of you, and some of you may not want to hear this. I'm not saying like you shouldn't pursue a legal career. You should still consider it, but consider other options. I could have gone down the path of working at one of the big four accounting firms and starting my career there. Consider your other passions, your other professional interests, your other degree, because sometimes those, that path may lead to a more fulfilling career. But if you realize that law is still for you, my ultimate advice is it's a long game. Start somewhere, even if it's small. It's not going to be the end of the world. You can still get to that, top tier law firm if that's what your heart truly desires. It would just take a bit longer, and that's okay. For some people, it takes a bit longer, but they last longer than someone who gets in immediately and burns themselves out. So I'd say, yeah, it's a long game at the end of the day. So as long as you get your foot in the door somewhere, things generally will play out, and you'll be okay.
Sure. For sure.
Thank you so much to all of you, to each and every one of you who is joining this webinar today. I hope you found it useful. I hope you can apply some of the tips and insights to aid your journey in practice. But a really big thank you to Jimmy Myo and Lucas Moctezuma.
Pleasure.
We've actually answered all the questions that were in the Q&A, which is fantastic. Thank you, Lucas, for that mammoth effort of typing in a lot of answers as we were going.
Yeah.
Remember, though, that Jimmy and Lucas are happy for you to connect with them on LinkedIn after this webinar. You can ask them questions if you have them. I'm also happy to connect. If you have any questions, please do reach out to me. You can also follow us on our socials and join our College Connect community to keep up with upcoming webinars. And finally, we would love to hear your feedback. So I'm going to just send through a quick survey to everyone so that you can determine what we ask next, or which panelists we have next. So any ideas would be great. I've just posted that link in the chat. And once this webinar has been finished, we will also send you an email with the recording of this webinar. So have a wonderful rest of your day. Hope to see you next time. See you later. Bye for now.
Good luck, everyone.
Luck. Be kind to yourself, people. It's a tough world out there.